Hello. The title of my presentation is Scholasticism a Pseudomorphosis? Identifying the Political Theology of Father George Florovsky. In my presentation, I will argue that Father George Florovsky's famous neopatristic synthesis was also his political theology. This synthesis integrated two concepts, which in Florovsky's interpretation were opposite. The so-called churchified Hellenism on the one hand, and also the so-called the Western captivity of Orthodox theology on the other. This captivity has led to what he called pseudomorphosis, or distortions of the presumably genuine Eastern theology. The churchified Hellenism was for Florovsky beneficial for the Church, in contrast to the Western captivity. The latter became amalgamated in the scholasticization of Orthodox theology. In his opus magnum, The Ways of Russian Theology, Florovsky used the word scholastic and its derivatives around 70 times, always with negative connotations. He has effectively created a myth of scholasticism, which still frames modern Orthodox theological thinking. However, can this myth survive the test by historical evidence? I am going to argue that scholasticism was not a Western design. It was transplanted to the Western soil from the East. It was originally constructed in the East as an attempt to synthesize the Christian revelation and the Greek philosophical traditions, primarily the Aristotelian dialectical component in Neoplatonism. I would define scholasticism as a systematic effort to identify and conceptualize commonalities, which facilitate the human mind to comprehend the dizzying variety of particular phenomena, be the latter divine or profane. Aristotle is credited for making a quantum leap towards making such an effort successful by introducing what he called things that are said, ta legomena, and predicaments, prosigorия. In the later commentaries on Aristotle's works, they became known as voices, phonē in Greek or voces in Latin. In the modern scholarship, they are usually called categories, after the treatise in which Aristotle discussed the most. The title of the treatise is Kategoriae, Categories. This treatise became the most commented upon among the entire Aristotelian corpus by the later generations of philosophers, primarily from the Neoplatonic school. Because of such interest in the categories, this school can also be called scholastic. The most famous Neoplatonic scholasticist was Porphyry of Tyre, who flourished in the second half of the 3rd century AD. His introduction, Εισαγωγή, to philosophy was received as the most popular handbook of scholasticism from the period of late antiquity through the Middle Ages. Christian theologians accepted Porphyry's scholasticism enthusiastically, even though he had been a militant anti-Christian. Indeed, in the entire period of Christian antiquity, one can hardly find a pagan thinker who would be as anti-Christian as Porphyry was. Notwithstanding this, Christians embraced the scholasticism that Porphyry had promulgated, and made it the primary logical tool to articulate their Trinitarian and incarnational theology. No one accused them of pseudomorphosis for doing that. What Father George Florovsky believed to be the genuine patristic theology had been constructed on the fundament of the Neoplatonic scholasticism. This theology, therefore, can be considered scholastic as well. Inherently scholastic, for example, is the differentiation between the categories of commonality and particularity. In Greek, it's to kinon and to idion. This differentiation dominated the taxonomy of logical categories in both Aristotle and Porphyry. Basil adopted and adapted it to distinguish between hypostasis and ousia in application to the Holy Trinity. The latter two categories became central in the Christian theology in the centuries that followed, in the same way as the originals, the first and the second ousia, had been central in the classical scholastics since Aristotle. One can hardly imagine in the entire Christian theology a term more scholastic than hypostasis. Ironically, the modern Orthodox anti-scholastic campaign spearheaded this term as opposed to scholasticism. Father George Florovsky was amongst the most outspoken activists of such a campaign. It has become a common point that Orthodox theology can be purged from the presumably Western scholasticism through the concept of personality, which is often believed to correspond to the classical logical category of hypostasis. Such an assumption, I would argue, is based on the misunderstanding of the origins of both scholasticism and the category of personhood. Scholasticism is originally Eastern, as we have demonstrated, and was copied in the West during the Middle Ages. The category of person is originally Western and was copied in the East in modern times. To use the words of Father George Florovsky, it is not scholasticism, but personalism, which is the Western pseudomorphosis, so to say. Even though I would personally not apply the word pseudomorphosis at all, I think it is not very helpful, either in application to the Western influences or to the concept of persona. Moreover, I would argue that the point of Father George, who was a personalist himself, by the way, about scholasticism as pseudomorphosis is itself a pseudomorphosis. Scholasticism as pseudomorphosis contradicts Father George's idea of the churchified Hellenism, because scholastic theology constitutes the core of such Hellenism. Indeed, when such great Christian minds as Origen, Apollinaris of Laodicea, or the Cappadocians carried out their grand projects of synthesis between Christianity and Hellenism, they took care to separate the polytheistic metaphysics from what they considered to be helpful in the pagan wisdom. Categories-based logics constituted the most helpful part of the pagan philosophy. After the Church Fathers distilled these logics from the pagan Neoplatonic spirituality, it was dry, unspiritual, uninspiring, in other words, very scholastic. Such tastelessness of the scholastic substrate extracted from the contemporary Neoplatonism made it usable in Christian theology. In other words, scholasticism was appropriated by the Church Fathers because it was scholastic, i.e., metaphysically neutral, spiritually flavorless, and intellectually dry. Now the question arises, what made Father George's look at scholasticism as a distortion of orthodoxy? I believe the residues of his ideological bias affected his optics and prevented him from seeing the contradiction in the concept of the Western scholasticism, as opposed to the churchified Hellenism. From his mid-20s through his mid-30s, young Florovsky was involved in the Eurasian movement, which evolved around the idea of Russia's civilizational uniqueness. The Eurasians, including Florovsky, believed that Russia should walk its own historical path, different from the one of the West. In the late 1920s, however, Florovsky denounced Eurasianism. Nevertheless, it seems he did not discard all Eurasian ideas completely. Some of them stayed in his project of neo-patristic synthesis. Although this synthesis should not be identified with Eurasianism, there are some similarities between them, such as speculating about a unique civilization different from the West. In the neo-patristic synthesis, Father George effectively substituted the Eurasian civilization with the Hellenic one and re-articulated the Eurasian anti-Westernism in the form of the opposition, rejection of the Western scholasticism. The assumed Western scholasticism became the main pretext for his assaults against the West. Such hidden anti-Western and civilizational agenda of Florovsky's neo-patristic synthesis suggests another paradox in his theological project. The last one that I'm going to explore shortly in my presentation. Although after renouncing Eurasianism and delving into theology, pure theology, so to say, Florovsky declaratively distanced himself from ideological and political programs of his younger years. He continued ideologizing and politicizing, now under the guise of his new project of neo-patristic synthesis. While abstaining from formulating his political theology explicitly, in the way his opponent, Father Sergius Bulgakov, was doing, Father George Florovsky implied apolitical theology in his seemingly apolitical writings. Not surprisingly, his theology was in many points opposite to the one of Bulgakov. It featured conservatism and anti-Westernism. That's where I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.